Red Dead Redemption 2 is one of, if not the greatest game of all time. For me personally, it is my favorite game of all time. It's one that I had always gone to, and frankly still do, whenever I want to just torment random NPCs, relax by just exploring the game's open world, or just sit back and enjoy a great story. And the story of Red Dead Redemption 2 is one that only gets deeper and more complex after multiple runs. It's really a game that I would say you should play for multiple runs, because Rockstar's writing within the game's story, the characters, and the interactions between them, there's so many different small nuances and details you can pick up on your 4th, 5th, or in my case, your 6th playthrough that you won't get on your 1st or even your 2nd. Not to mention taking your time and running into strangers you missed on your 1st run.
You should keep that thing in a cage.
You should think about who you're serving. Give me a beer, will you?
Or exploring a particular landmark as Arthur, for him to just illustrate and jot down that landmark or that person he ran into, to then revisit said journal entry years later in the game's epilogue as a John. It makes the world and the overall narrative feel that much more connected to the feeling we as real genuine people experience as loss and regret. Obviously, we played as Arthur, so we've seen him meet these people, we've seen him be at these locations, and we know what his reaction was like and what was going through his head at the time. And even if we don't, we're given a little bit of insight due to whatever thoughts and feelings he might have written down on the page. But from John's perspective, it's just, oh man, Arthur really met these people, he's been here, he's seen these things, and it just shows John's perspective in a point of view that we are all familiar with. It's a position of just being at the mercy of our own imagination.
That made it so tender. You know what? This place used to be a pig farm when we was kids. Before we lost our ma and pa. Horrible business.
Horrible.
But we still got each other, ain't that right, honey pie?
And we still know how to have a hog killing time.
Here, that's for you.
Yeah.
There.
Right now, I am currently in my 5th or 6th playthrough of the story, and that's basically because I thought I had 100%ed a previous run, but I didn't. I'm missing quite a bit of stuff that I thought I had collected before, and the reason why I feel it's so important to try to collect everything in one run is because you get Arthur's introspection. You get to see into his mind, his thoughts, his opinions on all these little things you collect as him. And I typically am the kind of person to just want to explore and find everything on my own. And unfortunately, this game is so damn massive with so many secrets and encounters to miss that it's just impossible to try and do all of that naturally. To find everything on your own in the appropriate timeline of the game's main story is damn near impossible, or you gotta be incredibly lucky. You have to consult with videos and articles online if you wish to find everything at the appropriate time, or at what might feel like the appropriate time. But through all the nuances of the game's story, how well the world and various environments within this game are beautifully crafted, and how great the characters such as Dutch van der Linde, Arthur Morgan, Micah Bell, and the various other members of the van der Linde gang are written, on top of their corresponding relationships between all of them and the gang at large. There are of course some things the game can be criticized for. People have pointed out plot holes. At times some things are left so vague it begs the question of whether if this game's narrative is really meant to be analyzed, the way myself and so many others have done before. And there's many things to be desired in the sections of Guarma, and even the epilogue itself. It's one thing to want the game to strive to do more. Trust me, this game does plenty already, and it does a lot of it very well. So well, in fact, it's difficult to even fathom how much further they could take it. But wanting the game to do more, or wishing certain parts provided either more gameplay opportunities or greater amounts of lore for the Red Dead universe at large, or, in my case, wishing some characters were used a little bit more, further developing their characters or their importance to the story or their connection to Arthur Morgan. But that's all an entirely different thing from when you misunderstand what the game does not want to be. Over the past few weeks, I've been putting out some community posts comparing Arthur to other van der Linde gang members, most notably John Marston. While those have been collecting many different votes, opinions, and perspectives on comparing the two protagonists of the Red Dead Redemption games, I've been going back and forth between the two games, preparing for a few videos regarding John Marston and his own journey of redemption in the first game, and contrasting that to Arthur's story of personal transformation that we see in the second. Both games have a few connecting points and main themes that I think have become staples of the Red Dead series, things that we are practically going to be expecting in any future installments. Most notably, the personal transformation of that game's main protagonist. It's a story that can always be taken up from different angles, but so far what we have seen are stories of the main protagonists doing their best at, well, redemption. Both Arthur and John do what they could to make up for their past decisions, lives they led that would be considered less than honorable. The nuances, circumstances, and desired outcome of the two are vastly different though. Arthur's life is on a clock. There's no hope for any kind of life that isn't tied to the ultimate feat of the Van der Linde game. Arthur's basically a walking dead man. He strives to make up for his past decisions and the person that he was by attempting to do as much good or perform as many things that were much more ethically sound, leading to a rich complex story of questioning if Arthur was ever a bad guy, or if he was just so loyal it was a character flaw. Arthur had a level of loyalty and love for his family and adopted father. He was all too willing to put his own ethics aside, not think twice about it, and just do what he was told. John, in some contexts, can be seen as not so noble with his intentions. Arthur tried to do good with any and everyone in his dying days. You could say that was selfish in of itself. A case of a little too late, desperately trying to do good anywhere he could just to alleviate a little of his own personal shame and guilt. John, in some ways, is a little more ruthless than Arthur. Now, we don't spend as much time with John as we do with Arthur. I think that's due to how evolved games have become, developing richer stories and more complex characters. Rockstar was possibly also just getting a feel for how a game like the original Red Dead Redemption would do, and that would explain why in some cases the original Red Dead Redemption game feels a little bit more like a Wild West game at times than the sequel does. While the sequel takes place years before the first game feels a lot more barren. It feels a lot more like when you help the law, you're rewarded appropriately, versus in the sequel, when you try to help the law, if you don't act the way the law feels like you should, you're automatically reprimanded. There's a few instances out in the open world, but to really compare the two one-to-one, you can just look at how both games handle bounties. John can accept a bounty and bring them back dead or alive. Alive will fetch you the bounty's full price, dead, the sheriff will still take it, but it cuts your bounty's price in half. John's fame and honor goes up, and we all move on. The sequel, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm almost entirely certain every single bounty has to be brought in alive. And that's not to mention the whole fame level is completely gone. So the idea of a legendary, infamous, or famous figure of the Wild West days are almost entirely omitted from the second game. Add in how weirdly difficult it is to bomb your honor level versus increasing it, and how bounty hunters seemingly always pop up out of the blue whenever you want to start a mission or interact with a stranger, and it just feels as if everything points towards Arthur's story leaning in a way that, outside of the main events of the game, show him as a good guy. The first game is always described as Grand Theft Auto with horses, or Grand Theft Auto in the Wild West. While that is inaccurate, the second game, I've heard, been described as an outlaw simulator. That is also entirely inaccurate. There's too many things set within this game that don't make that a reality. And that isn't really what the game is trying to do. What the game is trying to do, at least how I see it, is trying to create a world that best imitates how life was lived back in the 1800s. At the turn of the century, when outlaws, gunslingers, bandits, and weapon smugglers were on their way out, slowly smothered by the growing power of law enforcement and the gradual backing that law enforcement received from the local populace, tired of the bullying and harassment of the outlaws. Arthur may have been a bad guy, a ruthless, cold-blooded killer, and while that was still in him, and he was all too willing and capable to do whatever was necessary to survive, when we see him at this point in his life, he's not that much of a killer anymore. He's older, he's wiser, his family and himself are put to a test that none of them have ever had to face before. It's a world shown through the eyes of someone who was on the receiving end of being stomped out, someone who had their own internal struggles with what was right and what was wrong, only to have more pressure added on through the death sentence of tuberculosis. Game developers add in and remove stuff that makes sense narratively and gameplay wise. I think having such an aggressive bounty system with bounty hunters seemingly always popping up is a manifestation of a world that doesn't want them anymore. But it's also a gameplay addition to make sure you walk the straight and narrow, because holy shit can they get annoying. Some things, such as the fame bar in the first game, at a time much later when the world and law enforcement were even better equipped and had a stronger grasp on these wildlands, does seem a bit odd. But if we were to forget the vision in the game and what the devs had in mind, or even the technical limitations, and just look at it from strictly a gameplay perspective, contributing to understanding each character, their morals, their values, their actual goals, that would also mean that fame and infamy is technically important to John, which we could say is because Jack read so much about Legends of the Wild West and of course the wonderful stories of King Arthur and his knights. In John's perspective, maybe he just wants to make it into one of those books so that one day he could have that connection with his son, a connection that he tried so hard to have at the end of the first game and even during the epilogue of the second. But of course, that's just my perspective, my opinion, and I want to hear from you. What do you think about this? Is there anything else you want to add to this conversation? Am I spewing just BS and talking nonsense? Let me hear your thoughts down below. And like always, I want to take this time to thank you for watching yet another video, as well as wishing you all a happy new year. It's been a fantastic last few months, and I probably have another video coming up talking about that in the future of the channel. But in the meantime, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you all technically next year. Have a happy new year and a safe one.